Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at After Effects, and we're going to look at some basics, and in the second video we're going to look at some basic text animation and how we can use that to create some motion graphics. So when we open After Effects for a start, we'll see this interface. It's very similar to Premiere in terms of its colour, and you've got your timeline across the bottom, but it functions in a very different way. If yours doesn't have this toolbar down the side, I would suggest you just change your workspace to all panels, because that way you'll have all the little elements that you might want to dip into every now and again, like a line or a paragraph or something like that. But like I was saying, it's very different to Premiere, and it works in much the same way as Photoshop with layers. So this is really difficult to explain without showing you something. So let's get started with a composition, and I'll walk you through it. So when you first start a new composition, you're going to get asked what sort of composition you want, and typically you're going to be working on a 1920 by 1080 sort of resolution. That's a screen size, and then the duration at the bottom, by default it will probably have 30 in there, which means it's 30 seconds. The way this works is frames is these two here, then seconds, minutes and hours. So you probably don't want 30 seconds. I would probably say 10 seconds is probably long enough. Frame rate, 29.97 is the default, which is the actual size for 30 frames per second. It's actually the actual frame rate, and that's about it. You can give it a name if you want to. That'll appear when you save it. So let's just call it Basics and click OK. So that will appear up here, and by default it'll have a black background. There's nothing down here yet. Let's just make sure that fits in the screen. So 50. So there we can see it in the screen. So this is where we'll see what's happening. This little button here gives you access to its redraw. So if you're working at full resolution, sometimes your redraw will be really slow. So if your redraw is getting really slow, reduce it down to a quarter or something like that, and that'll help with the processor of the computer. Depending on what computer you're working on will depend on its power for that. Up here we've got our layer menu, which is where we're going to start with. So in here we've got new text, solid, light, camera, and a few other things that we're going to probably come on to in later dates, but we'll start with a new solid. Okay, so it's going to bring in a solid, and let's just give it a colour. So I've got a nice pink here, so let's use that I've used for the other things. So now we've got a background. Now this can be moved. You can move this all around the screen, but you're probably going to want to keep it in the centre. I don't know what that emoji thing was. And as you can see, it's appeared here at the bottom. Because it's a background, we're probably going to want to lock that, because we want to keep it in place, and then we'll not move it around when we're doing other things. So let's add something else. So let's add a shape. So we can actually go layer new shape layer if we wanted to, or we can just draw a shape on our screen. So let's just draw a shape. Let's draw a box. Now we'll get rid of the colour of that, so we can get rid of the outline, and let's change the fill colour to a nicer colour. So we'll use that purple that I was using earlier on. Okay, bit easier to see. So as you can see, it's created a shape layer already, and we didn't do it through the layer. We did it through just actually creating a shape. Now when you create things in After Effects, they have what's called a registration point, which is this thing here. It's an anchor point, and this is the thing that the computer registers as the point for animation. So wherever this point is what you're setting in your animation. It's not really seeing these bits, any of these points. It sees this anchor point here, and it's really important to make sure that when you start your animation that anchor point's where you want it, because that's where it's going to work from. So you can change that using the pan behind tool up here. I don't know why it's called the pan behind tool, because it doesn't really make an awful lot of sense. But the pan behind tool means that you can move the anchor point around. Okay. You can also make it snap to different parts of your object by holding the Control or the Command button down. So that is now in the center of my object. Down here, if we unpack our layer, we'll see some contents, and one of those contents is a transformation list. So if we were to go to rotation and I rotate this and I click and drag, you'll see that it rotates around the anchor point. If I was to move that anchor point, it rotates around the anchor point there. Equally, if we scale, it scales from that position. Sorry, I got the wrong one. It scales from that position, so as you can see it's scaling away from that point. It's moving away. And if I move it, it's this point that it's working from. Okay, so these are the properties that you can work with in transformation. So you've got anchor point, which moves the anchor point, position, which moves everything, scale, which is obviously reducing and increasing the size, rotation, and opacity. So opacity is obviously the intensity of the colour, how much we can see with it, the alpha of it. So let's just reset that. Okay, so let's just put that anchor point back in the middle, like so. So if we want to animate something, what we tend to do is, the way I do it is that I work backwards. So I animate where I want it to be before I animate where it's coming from. So if I know I want this square to end up in the middle of my screen, the best thing to do is to start my recording from where I want it to end up. So let's just go to 1 second. That's as good a place as any. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click the little stopwatch next to the position key here, and it'll turn blue. And it's added 2 keyframes. It's added a keyframe for the anchor point, and it's added a keyframe for the position. So now if I go back a few frames, now you can do 2, 3, 4, 5 on the keyboard using the Control key and the arrow keys, or you can just literally move the playhead. It's entirely up to you. So now I've moved the playhead backwards, I can now move my square to where I want it to start from. So this is its end point here, and this is its starting point here. And if I press spacebar on the keyboard, you'll now see what happens. The bigger the gap between the points, the longer the animation takes to play out. And as you can see, the slower it is, the more pedestrian it is and a little bit more boring it is. So wherever possible, you're probably going to want things to be quite zippy and quite quick. Okay, and you can do multiple things on the timeline with this object. So if I was to pause it there and then say, right, from that point there, I want it to rotate, so I can then click on the rotation keyframe. Now, although I would normally go backwards, you can still work forwards. So let's place that there and then rotate it round 90 degrees. So that's that. So now it moves in, it rotates round. And then the next thing I want to do is I will change its opacity. So from that point there, I will click on the stopwatch and then move it forward, and I will reduce the opacity. So now what happens is my little square comes on, rotates, and becomes invisible. So this bar here is the visibility bar, and this bar shows that this object would be visible if we didn't turn the opacity down. This object will be visible as long as this bar is. And if we want to shorten that, we can do by either dragging the bar back, so we can just drag the bar back like that. I'll actually just get rid of the transparency keyframes, and you can do that by just clicking on the stopwatch again. What it'll do is it'll just eliminate the keyframes. So now those keyframes don't exist. And you'll see as soon as I get to the end of this bar, my square disappears because that's where the visibility is. If I move forward, it becomes visible again. Nothing to do with anything on here, but the visibility is this. There's also a shortcut on the keyboard, which if I can remember, is Option on a Mac and Alt on a PC. And then you use the little curly brackets, which are next to the P key on the keyboard. So you've got two brackets next to the P key, which are like a curly bracket and a square bracket. Those will trim your visibility slider. So Option or Alt, right bracket, and then if you wanted to turn it off at the beginning, you can do the opposite bracket. So now that's all that's visible, and you can cut into this as well. So again, even though there's animation happening here, we only see it during this portion here. Okay. You can also change your work area. So this is your work area bar, and this means that when you're pressing play, it will just go between those 2 points. So the little red play bar is now going between each of those points and just starting again. Obviously, if this is all the way up here, it will play all the way along and then go back to the start again. So it's a good way of reviewing your animation by reducing the size of this little bar here, so you only see the bit that you want to see. So I could like just shuffle that there, and then it'll just play between those 2 points. The one at the top, this one is like the zoom. So this one zooms into your timeline, and it does the same down here. So the same thing is here. So it makes your timeline a little bit bigger. So it enables you to be able to see what's going on your screen a little bit easier, because if you're working on a small screen, it makes it a bit easier if you zoom in a little bit. You can zoom in all the way till you can actually see separate frames. So now we can see the playhead snapping to the separate frames. And obviously, because we set it up to 30 frames per second, there'll be 30 frames between frame number 1 second and 2 seconds. So there'll be 30 frames, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 frames between those points. Okay, so that's the basics. Let's just add another object to our screen so that we can see what's happening. So let's just let that little rotation play out. And we'll add a new layer, we'll add a new text layer. So let's just type in something. So just type in text. Okay, so this is now this layer, and it's called text, and this is shape layer. I'll just give that a different color so we can see what happens. Let's give that a yellow color. Okay, so we can see the text is on top of the shape layer. If I move the shape layer above this, it will be behind it. So if you're used to Photoshop, you can kind of like understand the order of the shape layers. So it's easy to move things about up and down. So let's just do a little bit of animation with that simply. So let's have that coming down there, and then let's have the text coming out from the middle of it. So let's, that point there, we shall start the text animation. So click down the arrows, click on the scale icon. So we're going to have it zooming up, and let's just set that to really small there, and then let's set that down to there. Let's just change the position. So if I move the position of this, it's not going to change anything of the animation because the position keyframes haven't been set. Like so. Now I don't want that to be visible while this is all going on, so what I do is I just trim that. So Option bracket, and then now it's not visible, and then Option bracket again, and it's not visible again. If I want to add a bit of opacity, I can just click on the opacity slider, drag that forward, reduce that back, and now it'll zoom in. Let's just make that a bit longer, it's a bit too short. So that's pretty simple. Also, you've got shortcuts to get to the different animated elements on your timeline. So if you select your layers and press U, it will open up anything that's animated. So U on the keyboard will show you anything that's animated within any layer that you select. If you press P on the keyboard, it will show you any position keyframes and the position element. If you press R, it will show you rotation. If you press S, it will show you scale. And if you press T, it'll show you opacity. I know you're thinking O, but it's not, it's T for transparency, even though it's called opacity. Work that one out. So P position, R rotation, S scale, T transparency, or if you want to see everything, it's U. And that will speed up your workflow no end, because obviously you're able to see things a bit easier. You can also turn layers off, so you don't have to see them all the time. So if I just turn off with that little eye, it'll turn that off, and it'll turn that off as well. And you can lock them like I did at the beginning with the background. Obviously now I won't be able to do anything with the animation. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed that. That's a basic introduction to After Effects. And in the next video, we'll show you a few little tips and tricks with animating text. See you in the next one.